Welcome to the Pharmacist Voice podcast, where we talk about pharmacy topics and careers so you feel connected to the profession of pharmacy and inspired to contribute to it. I am your host and Ohio pharmacist, Kim Newlove. This is episode 288. The 2024 Pharmacist Authors Series continues today with my guest, Dr. Helen Sairany. We're talking about her book, The We You Don't See: Understanding the Long Shadows of Trauma. You can find the show notes on thepharmacistvoice.com. Just click on the podcast tab and then find episode 288. And in the show notes, you will find a link to Helen's book. We're actually talking about her second book today, but both the first and the second books will be listed in the show notes on thepharmacistvoice.com. You'll also be able to find her social media links, her website, and more. The Pharmacist Authors Series has been more like a summer series. So I've got an author in June, an author in July, and an author in August. In the first episode in this series, which was last month, episode 282 in June of 2024, Dr. Steve Luke was on the show talking about his memoir titled A Pharmacist's Story, an authentic tale of true love, family, addiction, and the practice of pharmacy. Dr. Helen Sairany is the second author in the series here for the month of July, and then next month in August, Dr. Janan Sarwar and Dr. Thierry Chim will be on the podcast to talk about publishing in doses. Publishing in doses helps healthcare professionals self-publish books. Janan and Thierry are helping me publish an ebook this year, and yes, it will be available as an audiobook. What's the book about? Podcasting. It is called Pharmacist Podcaster, a podcast planning guide for pharmacy professionals. It's a lead magnet for the coaching side, the podcast coaching side of my business, which is called The Pharmacist's Voice. The three of us will be talking about my book and what it's like to work with publishing in doses. All of that is coming up in August. If you're interested in self-publishing, you need to listen to that episode. That ends the list of authors on the Pharmacist Authors Series this summer. Now, I'll introduce my guest, Dr. Helen Sairany. As a 7-year-old Kurdish child in Iraq, a country torn by war and conflict, Helen was spotted by a U.S. Marine. She had a grenade in her hand. That soldier saved Helen's life by exchanging the grenade for a bag of candy. He later escorted her and her family out of the war to seek refuge in the United States. Because of her turbulent childhood, Helen was diagnosed with complex PTSD in 2013. As a result, she aspires to live in a world where the vast majority are trauma-informed, feel psychologically safe and valued for their work, and return home fulfilled. Since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic began, Helen has been open about her dormant childhood trauma. She has been traveling worldwide to give talks on topics such as trauma-informed care, leadership, and the workforce. Helen is a world traveler. After traveling to more than 100 countries, she has developed an appreciation for the world's diverse mix of cultures, people, and traditions. Her interest in trauma stems from personal experiences of living through wars, navigating complex relationships, and continually learning what it means to be human. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Helen Sairany. Hi, Dr. Sairany. Welcome to the Pharmacist Voice podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Kim. Looking forward to having a very fun conversation.
Absolutely. May I call you Helen?
Yes, please.
Sounds great. I am looking forward to hearing about your book. You are going to inspire my audience to be writers. I'm sure of it. This is your second book that we're going to be talking about today. Would you like to introduce the title and then tell me a little bit about what it's about?
Yes. So the second book was inspired by the first one. And I know you've read the first one because that's how we met, Trading Grenades for Candy, which is about my childhood. It's about survival and it's about immigration to the U.S. I am a war survivor. I am a trauma survivor. So every now and then I will share snippets of my story with my audience. And then everybody would say, Helen, you have to write it down. You have to write it down. So the pandemic hit, and of course we were all stuck indoor. And what else other than writing was Helen supposed to do, right? So that's what I ended up writing my first book, which was my memoir. And before you publish any book, you have to have beta readers. Those are your future audience. So any comments by the beta readers have to be taken very serious, because if you don't take their comments serious, chances are their comments will show up in your reviews on Amazon. So I had 15 beta readers, and time and again, everybody would say there is a lot of mental health trauma, psychological trauma, emotional trauma in your story, but you're not giving us enough appetite to kind of delve into the impact of it on you as an adult and your adult relationships. So I go back to my publisher and I ask them if there's a way we could expand on the mental health aspect of trauma. And they said, Helen, you're only 35 and your book is already 400 pages. We are not going to expand because it's just not recommended. The book is just going to become overwhelming for your audience. So instead, what we decided to do, we got all the relational juice out of my first memoir. So the memoir that you have in your hand, Kim, was supposed to be 400 pages. So we got 50 pages out of it. And that is what led to the birth of book number 2, which is called The We You Don't See, Understanding the Long Shadows of Trauma. And I talk about my own life of living with PTSD and how I discovered that I had a mental health disability and how it shows up in my life. And I talk about 10 responses because there is a lot of responses to trauma. The mental health community likes to talk about it as a mental health disorder. I don't like to call mental health a disorder. I like to call it a trauma response. Mental health is simply a normal response to abnormal societal circumstances. So there are 10 responses that are deeply personal to me that shows up in life because of my coping mechanisms dealing with childhood adversity. So that's what this book is about. It's about my experiences living with trauma, and that's how what led to the birth of book number 2.
Got it. Thank you for sharing that. I did not actually know that the second book came as kind of like an encore presentation of additional material that did not appear in the first one. It's
Yes.
good to have an audience, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I bet once book number 1 came out, the audience was giving these reviews on Amazon that gave you that information, right? I mean, how else would you get that information?
Exactly. And I would be honest, I've been getting raving comments about the first one because it was so genuine, it was so sincere, it was so authentic. And this is important for your audience, especially in the era of AI, where AI can do anything for you. Let me tell you one thing, if you really want to have that deep, genuine connection with your audience, AI cannot do that. They cannot do that for you. So my writing has been very well taken because of the authenticity that comes with it. It's not a robotic tone. It's more like Helen being very raw, Helen being very genuine. And I can't emphasize the importance of this, especially with book number 2, because I talk about some of the struggles and how trauma shows up in my day-to-day interaction with the world.
Thank you for sharing that. That's very insightful that AI can never replace a story, somebody's real story.
Not at all. But unfortunately, a lot of people are taking that route just because they want to be an author. It's one thing to be an author, but it's another thing to kind of connect at a general level with your audience.
Yes, that's how you find your people. Because I know me, I'm a pharmacist, a voice actor, and a podcast host, which is a rare combination. And I'm also a parent of a child with autism. And that combination is so rare. I don't think AI could cook that up. You know what I
Mm-mm.
mean?
No,
Yeah,
not at all. Not at all.
absolutely. The overarching theme is trauma. So when you wrote this second book, you, like you said, took information that did not appear in book number 1 that your audience wanted to hear. And it sounds like there was a method to it. If you had to describe how the chapters are broken down, is it theme by theme? I think you mentioned 10 different things. Can you tell me a little bit about how it's broken down?
Yeah, it starts with chapter 1 is the most powerful chapter, and you always want to start off strong because that's your hook. You get your audience kind of hooked. And the reason why I struggled the most with chapter 1, I finished up the whole manuscript and I had to keep going back to chapter 1 because I compare my life to a life of a dictator, to the life of Hitler and Saddam. And I go into their mind because if you look at any dictator, the common denominator of all atrocities committed by dictatorship goes back to childhood adversity. Goes back to childhood adversity. Look at Hitler, look at Saddam, look at I don't know who. And I took upon myself, and it was really hard because Saddam gassed my people. Saddam killed my people. And Saddam is the reason why I'm in the States, and I had to struggle to immigrate and get out of a place that I called home. So it was really hard, but imagine the level of compassion I had to build for this dictator, to go into his head and to reason as to why he did what he did to my people, right? And then I realized that my life was no different than his life. We both went through atrocities. We both went through adversities, and we both reenacted our childhood trauma differently. He reenacted his childhood trauma through narcissism and craving for control, because a typical dictator craves for control, so he prevents future atrocities being committed against him because he was so violated as a child. But the second he became in charge, what did he do? He reenacted his own childhood to the most vulnerable child version of himself. I mean, think of how deep that is. So he committed atrocities against the Kurds, the Kurdish minorities, okay, the Shiite minorities, the Christian minorities, and the Jewish minorities of Iraq, because they were vulnerable. And when was Saddam violated? When he was a vulnerable child. So there's a lot of wisdom to be said about that. Now, I'm not validating his behavior, and I'm not saying, well, let's give, Hitler a pass. I am not. But think about what has happened to this individual as a child. So that was chapter 1. I relive it, and then I actually compare his experience to mine as to how I didn't envision his trauma to be any different than mine. And I started envisioning my own traumas by going through his, except I reenacted mine completely differently from what he did. I decided to choose a profession where I felt like I would always be needed. I would always be needed. I will always feel important. I would always, be given, validation. Because I know you've heard me speak, right? And why is this
I
important
have.
to me? Why is this important to me? Because as a child, my mother was emotionally distant. I didn't get any attachment or attunement from my mother. Not at a fault of her own. This is not an indictment on my mother, but because we were in a war zone. We were in a war zone. So when you're in a war, was my mother going to give me a Barbie doll, or was her number one priority, how can I do to prevent my child being bombed the way it's happening in Gaza? But as a child, having narcissistic needs, because I wanted to be the center of attention to my mother, I interpreted as I don't matter to my mother because she was never there for me. So I was never validated. Felt like I was not number one priority. So I chose a profession where I would always be needed. I would always feel important. And I've done a lot of work on myself, but I still have difficulties turning down speaking engagements and, things that I feel like would give me a recognition or accolade. I feel like I've gotten much, much better, but it's really hard because that lack in me always makes me want to crave for the next, if that makes sense. So that is the trauma reenactment that I talk about in chapter 1. So that's how it shows up. Like I said, it's 10 chapters, but it's 10 responses that Helen has to her own trauma. So chapter 1 is about family and how I compare myself to a life of a dictator. Chapter 2, I delve into my own traumas, but for you to understand some of the stuff that I talk about, you have to understand what trauma is. So there's a lot of explanation in terms of what trauma is all about. Chapter 3, I talk about my life with my dad. My dad was a war captive. So I started with a very emotional story as a 7-year-older where he puts me on a big rock in the middle of a river, and he says, I'm gonna go get us some stuff and I'll be back. So he leaves me by myself in the middle of a forest, and I see him get smaller and smaller as he kind of parts away from me, and then he never returns. And then I somehow make my way back after, because I was very young. The neighbors get me back, and by the time I make it back, I learned that my dad is gone. So I never grew up with a father figure. So I talk about, the family dysfunctionality. Now, I'm not saying dysfunctionality as if my family was screwed up. It's dysfunctionality as if you have to have a healthy father figure. And I didn't have that. Chapter 4, I talk about trauma bond, like how not having a father figure, does that translate to Helen falling for avoidance in male figures in her life? Someone who gives me like a lot of attention, it scares me because that's not something I'm used to, because I've never had that in my life, if that makes sense. So chapter 4 is trauma bond. Chapter 5 is about shame. You cannot address trauma without addressing shame. They go hand in hand. They're cousins. What is trauma? Trauma is about what happens inside of you at a physiological level because of what happened to you. What is shame? Shame says I'm bad. Shame says I'm no good. Shame says I'm forever broken. What is trauma? Trauma feeling broken within. So these how the two kind of go together. And until you address shame, there is no way out of trauma. So I talk about how shame kind of ran me like, like an addict. Like I would disconnect from people. Because I just didn't want to be exposed because I had a mental disability. Chapter 6 talks about racial trauma, my life of immigrating to the state and how I always treated like the other because of my curly hair, because of my accent, because of the way I spoke, because of the way I dressed. And I grew up in the South, and my whole experience after 9/11, I was almost demonized because somehow people thought I was the mastermind of 9/11. So all the discrimination and all the adoration that my family and I had to go through because of because of discrimination. Chapter 7 is about codependency. The way the world feels about Helen is the way Helen feels about herself. Oop, did I just say that? Yes, I did. That is codependency. That is codependency. The way the world feels about Helen is how Helen feels about herself. That's how vulnerable I am because I didn't grow up with the validation. So I seek validation outside of me. Does that make sense? That is codependency.
Yes.
That is codependency. So I talk about codependency because that is something that it's a defining thing in me. And it's been very, very hard to kind of develop those boundaries, if that makes sense. Chapter 8 is about the addict in all of us. Now, I'm not chemically addicted. I am not into gambling or other stuff that the society categorizes. But I do have an addiction in me because I have a lack. Any trauma victim, and that makes 70% of Americans, any trauma victim has a lack. And there has to be a substitute for the lack. Okay, a child who is deprived of attunement and attachment, it means their dopamine pathway and their endorphin pathways are not developed like a healthy person, which means they're more likely, according to the adverse childhood studies experience, they're more likely to substitute that lack with dopamine or opiates because their dopamine pathway and their endorphin pathway is not developed. That develops thanks to a strong bond with a caregiver as a child. So when you don't have that, you're more susceptible to substitute that with an external source of dopamine and endorphin. I am fortunate I have not been addicted to any chemical, but there are times where I feel like that lack at time leads me to do stuff that I'm not so proud of, if that makes sense. So it's called the addict on all of us. We all have it. Chapter 9 is about the scattered mindedness. The scattered mindedness. I'm agitated. I'm restless. I am, I freak out easily. I'm hypervigilant because typical symptoms of PTSD, right? I am clinically diagnosed with PTSD. But is that a response to trauma or is that ADHD? When you're restless, when you're agitated, remember that teacher will call you, your child is constantly disrupting kids in classroom and he's restless, he's not paying attention. Well, because that child is not getting the attention at home. So his source of engagement and interaction and attunement is classmates. That is what Maria Montessori told us before ADHD even became a thing, if that makes sense. But now we're just rubber stamping everybody with ADHD, and we're dumping pills, and 15% of American teenagers have ADHD. Now, chapter 10, which is the very last chapter, is on post-traumatic wisdom. Now, if you ask me, Helen, you're a world traveler, and who would you like to take on a world journey with you? I will tell you a trauma survivor, because there's so much wisdom. There is so much wisdom in these individuals. Who would I want to have dinner with? Trauma survivors. Because learning comes from experience, but wisdom comes from bad experience. And survivors have so much wisdom to share. So I end the book with a lot of wisdom. a lot of wisdom. So that is what the book is composed of: 10 chapters, deeply personal, lots of vulnerability, but it kind of sheds a lot of light on what trauma is really like from my own story.
Thank you for sharing chapter by chapter what is inside this book. I want to help my audience understand who the audience of the book is, because it sounds like you wrote it
Mhm.
from the position of a PTSD survivor. So, who would the book actually be for?
70% of Americans. According to CDC, 70% of Americans have trauma, and this book is for them.
Any trauma survivor, correct?
Any individual who feels in despair, who feels like, oh my God, my life is about to end. Read this book, and then you'll understand that you're not alone.
Good to know. And I am very interested to hear two things. I personally love author read audiobooks. I know that this is not available in audiobook, but is there any way you could read the hook that you were talking about in chapter 1 and maybe another excerpt as well? The floor is yours.
The hook on chapter 1. So we're going to read a paragraph in chapter 1, and then we'll go to one of my favorite sections in the book. So chapter 1 is called Dysfunctional Family. Have you ever wondered how an innocent child can grow up to become a ruthless dictator? As a Kurd from Iraq who suffered during the Ba'athist regime, I often wonder how a dictator like Saddam Hussein could ever have risen to power. Iraq is known as the birthplace of reading, writing, and math. More recently, it's been a center of knowledge, training some of the world's top scientists. So, how could such a great nation be ruled and ruined by someone who gassed his own people and attempted to ethnically cleanse my race as a whole? Throughout history, there have been many theories, yet to me as a Kurd, none have been satisfactory. So I delve into his life throughout the chapter.
Very good. Is that the first paragraph of chapter 1 by any chance?
Yes, it is. It is. I call it, like, I end each chapter with a tale, and I call it the tale of wisdom. And this is my favorite because, like I said, I'm a refugee. I came to the US as a refugee. I'm a war survivor. And I was one of those little girls like Gaza who was running for her life, running from starvation, from conflict, from war, from just everything that was imposed on her. So this is called The Tale of the Holocaust. I talk about Holocaust, and I've gone to Auschwitz myself, and there is a lot of discussion on Auschwitz in this book because of trauma. So I end this chapter with a comment that was made by Elif Shafak, one of my favorite Turkish novelists. In an interview, she was asked about her favorite type of books to read. She shared that she loved reading the memoirs of those who have survived the darkest chapters of human history, such as Holocaust, other genocides, and civil wars. I must admit, I'm drawn to the same types of books. I recently published my own memoir, Trading Grenades for Candy, A Kurdish Refugee's American Journey, which talks about my journey as a refugee trying to find a home in America. However, every time I finish reading a memoir of those who survived trauma, I often wonder, how is it possible that atrocities such as Holocaust, Al-Anfal, or Halabja could ever happen? And Halabja basically is where the dictator used the mustard gas to suffocate thousands of lives. That's where my mother is from. How is it possible that we still have police shooting innocent Black men and women, mass displacements of refugees, the Yazidi genocide in northern Iraq, the Rohingyas genocide in Myanmar? Is it because some human beings are intrinsically evil? Many would argue that refugees are nature's making, no different than natural disasters and not of a man-made catastrophe such as war. However, throughout history, the majority of atrocities and suffering brought upon humans is at the hand of other humans. So perhaps the opposite of good is not necessarily evil. The opposite of good is our numbness to the pain and suffering we collectively bring upon one another. Numbness is a term described as dissociation by the mental health community. Trauma has the power to undermine our sense of connection to our identity, body, humanity, and life as a whole. At its core, trauma is about losing that deep human to human and human to nature connection, as demonstrated in the words of stress and trauma expert Dr. Peter Levine. He says, trauma is about broken connection to the body, broken connection to our vitality, to reality, and to other. As a result, the world around us has become restrictive, narrow, limiting our power to relate to other humans and their suffering and develop an appreciation to nature. According to psychotherapist Dr. Resma Minakim, he says during trauma, the perpetrator tries to avoid the trauma of dehumanizing the victim by dissociating during the event, ignoring any impulse to process the trauma or discharge energy from their body. For too long, we have suffered from symptoms of religious extremism, racial injustice, and human rights violations. When we look deeply at the root cause of all tension in life, we find it all originates from unprocessed trauma. Until we appreciately address trauma, we will continue to live in an internal and societal chaos ruled by an overactive emotional brain. That pretty much sums up everything for me.
I appreciate you thoughtfully selecting that selection to read. Where was that located? Which chapter? Because I know you talked about the chapters 1 through 10 a little bit earlier.
So the very last part that I read is at the end of chapter 2. It's called
Okay.
The Tale of the Holocaust Survivor. And then the first excerpt was the very beginning of chapter 1. I start the book with the excerpt, a personalized story, and I end the book with a tale. I change in between so people don't get bored. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think that breaking things up, at least with your brain and what you're processing, fact heavy versus story,
Yeah,
activating the theater of the mind, so to speak, it can be
exactly.
helpful. It can even be helpful if there's subtitles or pictures, so
Yeah.
I appreciate what you did there. When you write a book, you as the author get to call the shot on how many chapters there are, what goes into the chapters, how you write the chapters. Like you said, you break it up with stories and
Mhm.
parts of the book. How did you know to write this book the way that you wrote it?
Oh my gosh, I've read 100 books on trauma, 100 books. I learned a lot how trauma presents itself. And I knew that this book had to be about Helen. There are a lot of responses that are not necessarily relevant to me. So if I wanted this book to be about Helen, but also to kind of educate people about trauma, I had to focus on things that were relevant to Helen. So the way I picked it was based on what I thought was a struggle in my life. And that continues to be a struggle in my life. So that's how I decided on these 10 themes. We kept going back and forth with a few chapters. We finally settled on those 10. I wanted to end the book on good terms. I knew there had to be wisdom somewhere. So chapter 10 was hard. I didn't want it to end with another like a response. So I wanted to end it with wisdom. Yeah.
I like that you ended it on wisdom. I think that through any painful event in life, if we can use it for a purpose, it's not a wasted challenge in our life. I like the pain to purpose theme. I enjoy learning from people who use that theme in whatever they do, whether they
Yeah.
form a company out of a pain and use it for a purpose, or they write something, or they choose their vocation because of it. So much respect. I like that you ended with wisdom.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. I think you're inspiring some of my audience to maybe write a book too, because I think when they realize that it's just as simple as sharing something about you authentically, you're talking about how the first book benefited the audience. They're asking for an encore. you've got more in you to share, and then it's up to you to organize it. I think that's inspirational, just talking through the whole process. And I love that you had an audience waiting for the second book to come out. Not everybody has that. And you also have a newsletter. I've seen an email newsletter that you've been sharing about this book in, right?
Yes, I am. And I've already put the word out about my third one. And I know we kind of briefly touched on this, which is going to be all on childhood baggage and how the childhood baggage bleeds into the workplace. So the third one is going to be more trauma in the workplace. I'm not saying that the corporate is traumatizing you, but it's more of like, how does the baggage, the childhood trauma kind of, if 70% of us have it, chances are 70% of us are playing this whole baggage into the workplace. So I'm really, it's the book is done, but I want to give the second one some time to kind of marinate in the market. But the third one is done, and it's continues to be a continuation of the trauma. And I'm already thinking of the fourth one, of course, which is also going to be on trauma. But it's just so much to talk about, so much to talk about. And the more you read, the more you get inspired. Time and again, people tell me, well, how can you be such an inspirational writer? How can you write so much? For you to write so much, you have to read a lot. You have to read a lot. You don't just become an author in the middle of nowhere, right? And I would say the one thing I would like to emphasize is authenticity. Authentic. Don't inflate it. Don't fake it just because you need to add in more words, or else you're just going to lose your audience. Remember how many books are on the shelf. What makes one individual to pick your book instead of someone else's?
Yes, you set yourself apart from all the other people who are writing about PTSD because your story is way different from everybody else's.
Exactly.
There's only one Helen Sairany.
Thank you. There are definitely people who have a lot of more wisdom to share. They just need that courage to go and talk and, share their story. Everybody has a story. Everybody does.
Absolutely. With that in mind, what advice would you give any pharmacists out there who are thinking about writing a book, about taking that first step to write that book?
First of all, the profession is in its own life support. I hate to say this, but that's the best way I can explain it. Why is it on life support? We can have another podcast just on this because it's just such a comprehensive topic. My writing has been very therapeutic for me. There are times where I just have to get the angst out of me, right? It hasn't been the easiest, but I would say we did talk about authenticity, which is important, but also talk about what got you where you needed to be, what got you where you needed to be. And always start writing with something that is for you. Because if you write for someone that is for others, I guarantee you, you're not going to be able to finish the manuscript because it was never about you, but it was about the other, right? So what is it about you? I mean, look at it. Each chapter was a direct reflection of me. I mean, there are so many trauma responses, but I only selected 10. I could have selected 20 because there are so many other responses out there, right? But if I did that, I'm like, I would lose my focus. I would lose my order. That's why I always bring it back to you, right? So focus on something that makes you stand out, that makes you authentic, that makes you relevant, and that makes you like a figure that could potentially help others one of those days.
I like that you're positioning what you're writing as the solution to somebody out there's problem. I
Yeah,
think that's how you get people to pick up that book and buy it.
exactly. Yeah.
Your book can be very beneficial for, like you said, 70% of Americans, right? Or is it 70% of people worldwide? What do you think?
Worldwide. But honestly, yeah, CDC says in the high 60s. So I don't want to give it 70 just yet. It is about 70 if you round it up, but 70% worldwide.
Okay. With that being said, you have a broad audience that you could be
Yes.
reaching. When is the right time for them to read this? When would it make the biggest impact?
Now, I know that sounds like a cliche, but now look at what's happening in the world.
Doesn't matter how old they are, just now because of the interesting times that we live in, right?
There's so many trauma in the world because of the wars. Remember what I said in the tale? Majority of trauma is inflicted by human, not by Mother Nature, not by tsunami, not by COVID, not by floods or hurricanes. Humans are always the source of trauma inflicted on other humans. Look what's happening in Sudan, in Gaza, in Haiti, in Ukraine, right? And I am a war survivor, and my trauma is because of war, So I would say now is because there's just so much adversity in the world. There is so many people who feel like in despair. Why do I say that? Because the three reasons why people are stressed are the following: lack of certainty, lack of control, and then the third one is conflict. Okay. An average independent is running the pharmacy with a minus 50 cents, and it takes $15 to fill a prescription. They're filling a prescription with minus 50 cents. They have no control over their situation. Look at the clawbacks. I don't know how much you know about the clawbacks. They fill the prescription, they close the transaction. Months down the line, they hear back from prescription PharmD. They owe this much money because they didn't meet a lousy metric. That is the uncertainty we're talking about. That is the lack of control we're talking about. And conflict. Do I need to even talk about the conflict? So lack of certainty, lack of control, and conflict. I just about explained the society. This is the society we live in. And you complain why there is so much mental health disorder in the world? Well, because we live in a society that permeates stress in all of us. And no, a medication will not solve the problem. We're all hyper triggered.
In your book, The We You Don't See, Understanding the Long Shadows of Trauma, do you give people tools of how to deal with trauma?
Every chapter.
Awesome.
Every chapter. Yeah, I switch back and forth a lot, like an ADHD, the scattered mindedness, right? Because by the time you get bored with my story, I switch to the psychology. By the time you get bored with the psychology, I switch back to the story. From the story, then tools to help you. From tools to help you to a tale of wisdom. So I switch a lot because I give information in snackable version to kind of help people, because the science can be intense for people. Like my memoir is light. You've read it. It's a story, but this one has more science to it. So I try to kind of change. And that has been very well taken by the audience.
People need tools and resources so that they can overcome the thing that they came to the book to learn about. So if they're trying to learn about trauma and they're trying to overcome that trauma, if you're dishing out or dispensing some sort of tools or resources, I think you're doing everybody a favor. That's good.
Yeah, every chapter there is a section on a tool. Yeah, every chapter has it. Yeah.
Very good. Now, let's say that somebody has read this book. They have just finished the last page. They've closed the book and they're like, what do I do now? Helen, what's the number one thing you want your readers to do after they finish the very last page?
It depends. How much it can be overwhelming. It can be really, really overwhelming. I would say if it's really overwhelming and if they feel like whatever resonated with them has been self-sabotaging their life, remember, change is hard. You can read a book and you're like, oh, she's full of wisdom. I admire her. Put the book down, move on with your life. Because change is hard. People usually don't change until staying the same becomes more painful than changing. People don't change until staying the same becomes more painful than changing. That's why you need a supportive environment. You need voices of wisdom. You need mentorship. You need an environment that supports change. So what I would say is, depending on the impact this book had on you and depending on how much willing you are to work on yourself, you cannot do it alone. You cannot do it alone, because you've formed these habits over the years and you're not going to instantly. This is not an Ozempic where you take an Ozempic and you're good, right? So I would say seek professional help. That's probably why I decided to do, trauma-informed coaching as part of my, business. Try to get a supportive environment that will not judge you, because a lot of time when you change, people are going to push back because they're not used to the new you, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. Change is hard. And what I hear you saying is that after they finish that last page, they close the book, you want them to consider making positive changes. And if they're unable to identify what those positive changes are, get some sort of help. Is that right?
Yes, because changes
Okay.
are in a step, and getting an outside help, it will kind of keep you in check for sure.
I think so too. I think just talking about the things that are really difficult for us with somebody who's not experiencing it can help us
Exactly.
understand that it's not as crazy as it feels in our head, or
Exactly.
it's not as simple on the other hand as what you may think it is. Maybe you need some help to
Exactly.
get through something. So yeah, I totally validate that remark because I think that would be very helpful for somebody to take your book as step one and have step two be making the change or getting the help. Can you tell me a little
Exactly.
bit about the coaching that you do? I mean, how would that fit in as the step two after reading the book?
So the coaching is basically is acknowledging that there is trauma between you and the client that is approaching you. So my coaching is very different from life coaching. And the reason I say this, um, mental health focuses a lot on talk therapy, cognitive therapy, logic, rationale. But what I tell people is trauma happens when an event is too much, too fast, too soon for your brain to comprehend. And trauma is like, it's like that bear comes after you. So when the bear comes after you, do you think the talk therapy is going to be effective?
No.
Do you think the logic is going to work? Good luck trying logic with a bear, right? Logic, talk therapy, cognitive therapy, all that gets thrown out of the window. Your number one priority is survival. Gee, what can I do to run away from this bear so I can survive? That is trauma. So I don't do talk therapy. My coaching is more about regulating the nervous system. Let's get back to the polyvagal therapy. Let's get back to, yeah. And I know for sure when the person is speaking from a dysregulated state, and I help with tools and resources to regulate the responses. I say this with all my heart. The number one predictor of thriving in life is how regulated your emotional response is. One response could destroy your life. One response could get you fired. One response could cost you your relationship. And it all goes back to the amygdala, the bear. Okay. So how regulated are you? Because if you keep functioning from a dysregulated state over and over and over, then you're the common denominator here. How many bosses are assholes? How many exes are narcissists? Until you're like, you know what? I am the common denominator here. How about some ownership here? So that's the approach we take. There's a lot of subconscious awakening, a lot of pattern breakdowns, and it's a lot of conscious engineering, but it's all rooted back to trauma.
Thanks for talking about your coaching. I, until today, didn't know a whole lot about it. I get your newsletter. Can't say that I read 100% of it, but it's so nice to hear you talking about it because I think that you could help a lot of people.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That's the goal. It's about the impact.
Absolutely. All these things that you've gone through in your life and all that you've learned and all that you've written, it's so good that you're able to just, help others with that.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Sure, sure. I hope that any pharmacist listening to this who's thinking about writing a book can see the impact that Helen has had on her audience and through her coaching as well. And she's able to help so many people. And you could too if you write your book or, you know, uh, build a practice doing something that has helped you and you want to help others as well. So back to the interview though, Helen, I want to ask you just like two more questions. Do you happen to have time for this?
Yes.
All right. We already talked about why your audience should read this book to get help with trauma, right?
Yes.
If you had to say the number one thing that someone will get from reading this book, what's the number one thing?
Awareness. Awareness of some of the self-sabotaging patterns in their life.
And that's a great reason.
Majority of people are not aware. By the time we're 35, 95% of us are subconscious. 95%. And this goes back to why I question the performance reviews. I question judgment. I question because 95% of you is subconscious.
Let's talk about those performance reviews for a second, because one of the reasons I left Walgreens back in 2011 after 9 years was that I
Just
would
open
get
the
these.
can of worms.
Oh yeah,
Just,
I'll just open one can. How's that?
okay.
That's a triggering comment. I remember back in the day I felt like arbitrary numbers. You have to fill a
Yeah.
prescription within this number of minutes, and I would be off by 1 minute sometimes. And my
Yeah.
boss would stand in the doorway, open the door for me to come into work after he had been there for 6 hours or whatever. And he would have these, they called them KPIs, and he'd have them rolled up. I've got a piece of paper right here. I'm going to roll it up. And I felt like I was a dog walking into the house about to get bopped on the nose by a newspaper. He didn't touch me with it, but he would open it up then and he'd be like, your KPIs aren't as good as so and so. And yeah, so I didn't even have to wait for an annual performance review every time I came in on a
That
Wednesday.
is
He
that
was
is
waiting.
cruel. That is cruel. That is
Yeah.
cruel. Good luck doing that with the Z generations.
Yeah. How will they respond? I'm kind of curious.
They're not going to put up. They have zero tolerance for this BS. Yeah. Yeah, I just called it BS. Zero tolerance. The performance I'm talking about here is basically when the boss sits with you after a year. You did this, you were not supposed to do that, you were supposed to do this. 95% of it is a deflection of their own biases on you. And that is why, that's why performances, I always, in my talks, I challenge it. I don't think it's a good idea. 95% of it's based on some of the bad and painful experiences that this individual has had, and they deflected on you. So it's not an accurate measure of how good you are. And we've all had bad reviews, we've all had good reviews, and we've all had reviews where we're just a rubber stamp to get through, because who wants to do it, right? The most effective way is to have consistent follow-up and engage, and that is how I get into the saboteurs with my staff when I was a CEO. Saboteurs are far more effective than having a review that just at end of the year, just slap your staff with a couple numbers and give them a percentage. Not effective. It's a lazy way of doing things. So yeah.
Thank you. I actually feel a little bit better hearing you talk about this. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. Performances are never personal. They're not. It's a reflection more on the individual that gave than on you. Yeah.
Yeah, I never thought about it that way.
Oh yeah, it
I'm
is. Yeah.
I'm going to put the lid back on the can of worms because I totally opened that. I think we could do a whole entire episode on how the trauma from performance reviews affects individuals. There's
Yeah.
so much that could be said.
Oh
All
my God,
right.
don't get me started. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It is cathartic to talk about it. So thank you for that moment.
Of course. That's why trauma informed coaching is helpful. Oh yeah. Someone gets it, right?
Oh, yeah. Yes, I appreciate that. All right. As we start to wrap this up, two last questions. I know I said two before, but two more here. One, where can my audience buy your book?
They can order on Amazon.
Okay.
And if they want author copies, they need to find me on the website and I'll send them signed author copies. Yeah. And my website is drhelensairany.com.
Okay. Thank you for mentioning that. I will put that in the show notes on the pharmacistvoice.com.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes.
And the real last question here is
Okay.
this is kind of like an open mic moment. Is there anything else you'd like to share? Anything that you're promoting here in 2024? The floor is yours.
I would say I am the very first pharmacist in the country to kind of touch on this very, very sensitive topic on trauma. And I've developed a national and a global, because I'm making this available to the FIP members as well at a global level. My training I put together, and I put my heart and soul into this training, and I'm making that available to every single pharmacist. My takeaway is trauma is not limited to combat veterans. Everybody thinks war when they think trauma. Everybody thinks domestic violence. If 70% of the population in the world is struggling with trauma, it means there are other sources of trauma. For every combat veteran that gets deployed overseas for whatever war we declare on whatever country, there are 10 children in our back neighborhood that grew up in traumatic environments. And if you don't address this childhood baggage because of trauma, that baggage bleeds all over you in the workplace. And you can keep blaming boss after boss and skip marriage after marriage after marriage until you take a step back and develop that awareness that I talked about, that you're the common denominator and you need to do something. I'm not saying the guy was not a narcissist. I'm not saying the boss was not an asshole. But what makes you fall for them? There is something in you that we need to alter, if that makes sense. So that's my takeaway.
Thank you. I appreciate those words of wisdom. It's kind of like the theme with your book. Chapter 10 was words of wisdom, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
We're ending with some words of wisdom here. Dr. Helen Sairany, thank you so much for being here on the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Dr. Helen Sairany for being my guest today on episode 288 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. I bought the Kindle version of The We You Don't See, Understanding the Long Shadows of Trauma by Dr. Helen Sairany, but I haven't finished it yet. I'm one of those readers that likes to write reviews, so I plan to write a review on Amazon.com when I finish. Ratings and reviews help readers buy books. So when you read Dr. Helen Sairany's books, whether it's the first one, the second one, or both, please leave a review on Amazon as well. Since I admitted I have not read the whole book yet, I must say that I do look forward to learning more about trauma. I only know so much. I know Helen knows so much more. But once I learn about it, I want to identify my own saboteurs. I took a saboteur inventory. My friend Dr. Brigitte Surfady had told me about it, and Dr. Lauren Castle as well. So I took a brief survey online. I am what you call a hyper rational person, which I don't know if that's good or bad, but I'm basically a woman who acts like a man. If you know many female engineers or military women, I am very much like that. I am very direct, to the point, and there's not much guesswork to be done. I'm like a woman who acts like a man. That could be a saboteur, though. So when people walk up to a woman, they expect to talk to somebody who acts like a woman. I kind of act like a man. So once I identify more about myself and my saboteurs, I look forward to facing my own challenges. I just mentioned what I think one of my challenges may be. What you see is not always what you get with Kim Newlove. But then I also look forward to using the tools and the resources in the book and maybe even taking one of Dr. Sairany's online courses. I heard Dr. Sairany, speak at the annual meeting of the Ohio Pharmacists Association in 2023. That was just a little over a year as I record this in July of 2024. And I can assure you that Dr. Sairany is a passionate speaker. She's very passionate about trauma. And I did enjoy her first book, which is called Trading Grenades for Candy, A Kurdish Refugee's American Journey. You have to read this book, and the beginning of it is amazing. Like her mom and all the kids she had and how little education she had. It's just amazing. And Helen is an amazing person for all that she has overcome. If you know someone who might like Helen's books or an organization who needs to learn about trauma, please share this episode or Helen's name and contact information with them. And if you're thinking of writing a book, I hope that Helen has inspired you to get started today. Thank you for listening to episode 288 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Please visit thepharmacistvoice.com to read the show notes. In the show notes, you will find a link to Helen's website. I got to talk about the website real quick. Be sure to sign up for her weekly newsletter while you're on the website, and also click the Programs tab. On the website, there's a Programs tab, and there are two things that you need to check out. They are the Certificate Training Program and the courses. Also in the show notes today, you will find Dr. Helen Sairany's social media links, a link to both of her books, links to the other interviews in the Pharmacist Authors Series, my social media links, and more. Everything you need is on thepharmacistvoice.com. If you know a pharmacist who's interested in writing a book or learning about trauma, please share this episode with them. And if you like this podcast, go ahead and get out your smartphone, open up your podcast player, and click subscribe or follow the Pharmacist Voice podcast right now on your favorite podcast player or YouTube to get each new episode right when it comes out. Thanks for listening today. I will talk to you next Friday.